who is a reader in the history of mathematics at St. Andrews. Most of her work has focused on the interactions between mathematics and physics in the 19th century. However, in the last years, she has been dipping back to maths and natural philosophy in the 17th and the early 18th century Scotland, partly prompted by the interests of various undergraduate and postgraduate students. Isobel is presenting a work in progress carried out jointly with David Horowitz, entitled Colin Maclaurin and the Good-Seeking Forces of Mind. And for here at Aberdeen, especially the subject matter of Isobel's talk today, we're delighted to welcome it, especially because Colin Maclaurin has a very special place in our hearts as the Duncan Little Professor of Mathematics at Marshall College between 1717 and 1727, even though that he departed for Edinburgh in 1725. He didn't formally demit until a couple of years later. So with that being said, yet again, we're delighted to welcome you, Isobel, and I will turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Brad, for that introduction. I will endeavour now to share my slides. Right, good. I hope I've got my slides shared now and that you can all hear me. So unless anyone says no, I'll carry on. So yeah, great. Thank you very much for the invitation to come and try this work in progress out on an audience who probably know quite a lot more about this period than I do. It's not my period, but as Brad says, I've recently been dipping back and getting involved in several early modern projects. And I'd really welcome feedback from those of you who do know much more about early modern Scotland than David and I do. So David Horowitz is one of the postgraduate students I referred to who got really interested in this work, Colin Maclaurin's early youthful dissertation on good-seeking forces of minds, and has done a great deal of the legwork for this talk. We've been working through the essay together and debating what it means. David's based over in California, though, so this is a slightly antisocial hour of the morning for him, so I'm presenting. And before I go any further, many thanks also to a number of people who've been helpful, particularly to Ian Tweddle, who translated the manuscript of De Viribus in 2008 and has kindly allowed us to use his unpublished work and notes. Also to Christine Shepherd, whose thesis and correspondence with us has been invaluable. Michael Brown at Aberdeen, I believe, who's discussed with David his work on Francis Hutcheson, and Robert McLean at Glasgow in the library, who's provided photographs of some of their archives for us. So for those who aren't familiar with Colin Maclaurin, he's the most famous Scottish, possibly most famous British mathematician of the 18th century, best known for the eponymous Maclaurin series and for his robust defence of Newtonian calculus against the attacks of Bishop Berkeley. He was born in Kilmodon in Argyll and Bute, where his father was a Church of Scotland minister. His father died there when he was 6 weeks old, and Maclaurin was brought up, first of all, by his mother, and subsequently, when she also died, by his uncle, another Church of Scotland minister. And Maclaurin's older brother, John, also became a Church of Scotland minister. So they're very much within that sort of orbit, the Church of Scotland orbit. Maclaurin matriculated in 1709 at Glasgow, graduated in 1713 with a thesis on gravity and other natural forces. He started to study divinity at Glasgow, but abandoned it because he said he became disgusted at the dissensions that at the time crept into the church. In 1717, as Brad mentioned, he was elected Professor of Mathematics at Marischal College in Aberdeen. He took a bit of time off in 1719 to go down to London and made a lot of, built his networks down in London, was elected an FRS. And then from 1722 to 24, he toured Europe in charge of a young nobleman whose name I temporarily forget. And he established a European network and won a prize from the Académie des Sciences in Paris for a memoir on percussion. So he was very well sort of tied into both British and European maths, natural philosophy networks. In 1725, partly on Newton's recommendation, he got a position at Edinburgh, co-teaching with the elderly James Gregory, and he gradually, as Gregory got old and died, Maclaurin took over. But again, as Brad mentioned, he didn't formally demit from Aberdeen until 1727. Got married in 1733. In 1742, his most famous work, his treatise on fluxions, which was his defense of Newton, appeared. In 1745, he took charge of the defence of Edinburgh against the Jacobite army who were advancing. But when Edinburgh opened its gates to the Jacobites, he fled down to York, fell off his horse, got a chill on the way, and died fairly soon from the consequent ill health after his return to Edinburgh, and had a couple of posthumous works published, particularly his treatise on algebra. So that's Maclaurin very briefly. So de Viribus, the work that we're mainly interested in, Maclaurin wrote in 1714, just a year after he'd graduated at Glasgow. So it's pertinent to look at what he might have picked up at Glasgow. Glasgow was still teaching under the Regent system. Edinburgh was the only university at the time that had moved over to a professorial system whereby specialist teachers taught their own subjects. In Glasgow, regents, as primary school teachers today, took their class through the entire curriculum. Glasgow had a slight variation in that the first year, Greek in the first year was taught by one person, Alexander Dunlop, and then for years 2 to 4, the students got passed over to a regent. And in the case of Maclaurin, it was Gershon Carmichael. And we've got here a quote from Carmichael saying, what he taught, how he organised the curriculum, certainly for the 4th year, but looking back at what he should have been getting through in the previous years. The first work must be to complete what yet remains undone of ethics, and then, if possible, to glance over pneumatic and ethic theses. Pneumatic here means pneumatology at consideration of the soul. At the same time, I must endeavour with all convenient speed to get them through at least the 6th book of Cardy's Elements. Without much, they can make very few steps to purpose in physics. I must likewise give them a touch of some other parts of geometry as time will allow, but for their more thorough acquaintance with them, refer them to the Professor of Mathematics. And following this, as I said, Maclaurin graduated with his thesis on gravity and other natural forces. Now, as we can see from Carmichael's outline of the curriculum, there's actually very little space for the maths professor. able students, if they need more maths, might get referred to the professor of mathematics. But Carmichael was the primary source of teaching for Maclaurin. Now this actually goes against, and yet this appears to go against most of the biographies of Maclaurin, who have attributed almost all his interest in mathematics and natural philosophy to his acquaintance with Robert Simpson, who was the recently arrived professor of mathematics. But there's very little good evidence that Maclaurin actually attended Simpson's lectures at this time. He may have done under this sort of refer them to the professor of mathematics scheme, but the tenor of his work is much more in the lines of what Carmichael was teaching, along the lines of Newtonian natural philosophy, than it was the very sort of Greek geometric methods that Simpson was primarily interested in. Maclaurin, as I said, started a theology postgraduate year when he definitely attended lectures by John Simpson, the professor of theology. And as I was saying, although he may or may not have attended Robert Simpson's lectures, he was certainly very friendly with Robert Simpson later on in life. So there's definitely an influence there, but how much at this early stage, it's very difficult to provide any evidence for. So what did he learn from Carmichael, who's someone who's really been, whose influence on Maclaurin is someone who's really been very much overlooked in most of the standard work? Well, Carmichael, we know we've got graduation theses from Carmichael. Graduation theses were generally prepared by the regent for their students to argue when graduating. Maclaurin's on gravity was one of the first tranche that was actually prepared by the students. So we've got earlier graduation theses provided by Carmichael. We know about them from that. We've also got student dictates from his lectures. So we know a fair bit about Carmichael's actual teaching. He was generally anti-Cartesian, and pertinent here, he was very much holding that mind is a substance different from matter, created by God alone, has no existence prior to union with the body. He appeals repeatedly to empirically based arguments for God's existence. So in this then next quote, which is one of Maclaurin's dictates, so notes taken down in dictation from Carmichael, on the human mind is adapted to choosing its own ideas by means of characteristics inherent to itself. These are impressed on it not at the first creation of the mind, but later when it has the opportunity of observing the objects presented to it. Those objects presented to the mind have been orchestrated by God, essentially. Along the lines of Carmichael's appeal to empirically based observational of the natural world as an argument for God's existence. So coming on to look at Maclaurin's thesis on gravity very briefly, as I said, it's the first tranche of student-produced theses. And as you can see, these are the notes from the Senate notes. And the bottom one, page 60, it lists who was present at this meeting, it lists the theses presented, and it's very clear that the faculty, this is pre-public presentation of the thesis, pre-public disputation. The faculty was vetting them before they went public. The bottom says, the faculty, having heard the said theses, found nothing in them contrary to faith and good manner, and therefore allows the same to be printed, that the said candidates may have opportunity of defending them publicly sine praesodio, in order to their obtaining the degree of arts. Colin Maclaurin is the bottom one listed here. The thesis itself was dialectic in the sense that all possible views of gravity were covered and argued against, except the Newtonian view that Maclaurin was promoting. There's an emphasis on experimental evidence, and he concludes that gravity is an incorporeal force whose course is an intelligent will, i.e. God, and reaches this conclusion through what we would call essentially an argument by design. What type this intelligent cause may be will easily be accessible to anyone who considers that the whole structure of the globe of the earth is preserved and strengthened by this very gravity. The Lord of the earth and the preserver of mankind is to be recognised most deservedly as the creator of gravity. Now, Colin Maclaurin's uncle, Daniel Maclaurin, who I said here brought him up in his latter years, sent a copy of this thesis to Colin Campbell in 1713. Colin Campbell was an influential Scot and essentially the Scottish equivalent of Marin Mersenne or of Henry Oldenburg, acted as a clearinghouse for review and dissemination of work. But also the elder Maclaurin may have been hoping to attract some sort of patronage for Colin in what at the time was probably envisaged as a career as a minister in the Church of Scotland. However, the next year, having had this contact made by his uncle, Colin writes to Colin Campbell off his own bat about a number of things, but in closing this dissertation that we're about to talk about, since I've mentioned the use of mathematics, I beg your pardon for troubling you with some thoughts I have relating to their use in morality. I've sent them to you under the title of De Viribus Mentium Bonipatis, the good-seeking forces of minds. Here it is. It's the booklet, pamphlet notebook languished in the Colin Campbell collection at Edinburgh University for a couple of 100 years, really. It was unearthed by John Eaton in the 1950s, but not who partially transcribed it and included it in his compilation of Maclaurin materials, but didn't take any further notice of it. And the first person really to look at it at all was Eric Sageng in his PhD thesis in 1989. Since then, a few others have glanced at it, most notably Judith Grabina and Oliver Bruno. Translation is due to Ian Tweddle, who around 2008 was the first person really to do a full careful translation and analysis of the manuscript in what is still an unpublished paper. He provides extensive notes on the technical content of De Viribus, but he approaches it essentially as a mathematical document, and he does not examine the historical, theological, or personal context. As you can see, it's a small book. There's a ruler along the bottom here, so the page is about 3.5 inches wide by about 6 inches high. Quite small, and Maclaurin gets straight into his argument, setting up what's essentially a Newtonian model of the forces, the good-seeking forces of mind. down at the bottom of page 1. So here's a detail at the bottom of that page. He starts off by showing how to compute a total good using Newtonian calculus. And then, having done that, later on, he goes on to assume an incorporeal force between the good and the mind. And he tests various possible force laws against experiential and theological evidence. So the bottom of this page and the top of the next page, he's setting up the computation of the good. And we can see here the second and third line, his use of Newtonian fluxional calculus in computing the good. But I've recast it down in the diagram at the bottom in more familiar modern integral format. So the diagram is a tidying up of Maclaurin's freehand diagram, but the notes here I've added from how Maclaurin describes the diagram. So the figure is a good. It lasts for a time, a measured time, and its intensity at any moment is the height of the curve above the horizontal axis of time. So the total good between the point the time A and the time P, or T1 and T2, is the integral of the intensity measured vertically between time T1 and T2. And then in grey, I've put the gravitational equivalent. So if we think, instead of thinking of this object as a good, we think of it as a mass. He's computing the good in exactly the same way you would compute the mass of that object, where for computing a mass, you've got a distance along the horizontal axis, and you've got the instantaneous, or the mass at that point, measured vertically. Now, some of his goods haven't abounded at the end, as in this line BC, but some of them are unbounded. They go on infinitely. He shows very briefly how an unbounded intensity, this, because C never quite meets B, even if you go on forever, actually may give rise to a finite good, using a standard geometric result at the time. He never really says, but it's clear when you sort of interpret and dive into what he's doing, that the goods he considers that extend to infinity generally mean reward in heaven, and that AD is the point of death, and you might be somewhere over here before death. No, he never really articulates that. Sometimes he talks later, as we'll see later, he talks about present good. And this is a confusion that's crept in throughout the document. The first of his theological arguments comes, though, when he considers a uniform but infinite good, this AD CB, and again, AD indicating that it's after death. And he looks at the benefits you would get from increment by increasing the time you receive the good for, so into your lifetime before death, or the increments you would get from increasing the intensity after death. And he concludes that the increment from increasing intensity after death, because it goes on to infinity, is adding to the good that you get. it's infinitely more preferable to increase the intensity of an infinitely lasting good thing up here by the smallest possible quantity than to extend its duration as far as possible. So this, because it goes on forever and is infinite, is much better than this, which is during your lifetime and is finite. And then the theological bit, therefore the complaints by good men about the miseries of this life ought to be taken away by a consideration of the increment to the intensity of future eternal happiness which arises therefrom, whereby it may perchance happen that their whole future happiness taken together may be greater than if the starting point is assumed at the beginning of their existence and man had never fallen. So the fall, the expulsion from Eden, etc., you would be in a state of grace throughout your life, but that would provide a finite increment. Whereas because if you're miserable in this life, your gratitude for what you're getting in the afterlife is that much greater. You get an increment that goes on forever. So actually you're better off having had the fall of man, and you oughtn't to be complaining about it, and you oughtn't to be complaining about the miseries of this life. So far he's considered a uniform force. He's only looked at the computation of the good. He now adds in possible forces that vary with the time between you, indicated by the stick man, and the good. Now this is just a random curve. He goes through 4 different possible forces and tests them against his experience and his theological beliefs. Now the first one, other than the uniform force that he looks at, is this hyperbolic force that's coming down here. And in this proposition 3, he assumes an increasing good. So effectively, the compound of the two is to mean that the overall force of that good on your mind is a constant, except at the present time, at time 0, where the hyperbola shoots off up to infinity and he doesn't really quite know how to handle it. In the next proposition, proposition 4, it's not clear whether he's still talking about this situation with an increasing good, or whether he's reverted to using a uniform good. Either way, he's still in this situation where he's got an asymptote, a force that's shooting off up to infinity at the present time. The force into the present good thing is infinitely greater than the force into the same good thing removed even by a very small distance, and never at any non-infinite distance is it nothing. And then these 2 last corollaries trouble me to the extent that I'm of the opinion that this hypothesis is not true. Now this is very puzzling because he never says quite what troubles him about these consequences of the mathematics. He doesn't say whether it's the mathematical problem, that he doesn't quite know how to handle this asymptote, whether it's the physical problem of some sort of infinite force, or whether it's a theological problem. That remains an issue. So that was, he rejects this hyperbolic force law on these grounds, and goes on, he begins arguing towards his final conclusion, looking for a force law that has a rapid decrease when the force is high and a slower decrease when the force is low. It's clear that the good-seeking accelerating force does not decrease uniformly, but rather it decreases more rapidly while it is greater and more slowly when it becomes smaller, so that the decrease of force is as the force itself or some power of it. The law he's just been describing here is essentially an exponential decay, and he likes it, except that it operates with this single difficulty, that the good-seeking force vanishes at infinite distance only, and consequently it seems that it cannot hold in the good things of this life. And again, he raises the problem of infinite force into a present good thing being unacceptable here, when he says he's already rejected the hyperbolic. Consequently, the force into the present good thing would be infinite. He then goes on to discuss the consequences of some of the other laws that he's already looked at, and concludes that the only remaining possible law is a power law where the power is between 0 and 1, so he picks a half, ending up with a quadratic form for the power law for his accelerating, good-seeking, accelerating force, described by this curve EMB. And this satisfies his criteria that it's finite at the present time, as shown by OE. It also decreases to nothing at a finite time B. And this is where his thesis ends. He's happy with this law. Now, there are a number of issues that we haven't really sorted out yet with this thesis that would very much, welcome thoughts, suggestions, feedback on. The first is the sort of entangled ideas about the relation to Calvinism, predestination, unconditional election, that however good you are in the current life, you're not going to be rewarded extra in heaven, or you may not even go to heaven at all. That God's grace was preordained from your birth, and you can't do anything about it. And the relation between that and whether these forces of mind, good-seeking forces of mind, are something that you can take action as a result of, you have the freedom of will to take action, or whether, again, they're just entirely determined by God. Now, the idea of predestination was beginning to be rejected in these sort of early, just pre-enlightenment, among these early pre-enlightenment intellectuals. We see some evidence that Maclaurin is rejecting it, because when we go back to that diagram of the uniform good that goes on forever and the increment that you can get after death, one of the ways you might get that increment was by performing good deeds in this world. So there's evidence there that Maclaurin is rejecting that Calvinist, or becoming more liberal in that Calvinist sort of predestination view. But it's still not clear whether these good-seeking forces of mind are endowed essentially by God. Undoubtedly they will, but whether you have any control over them or not is something we haven't sorted out. It's not at all clear yet to us what bothered Maclaurin about an infinite force at the present time, or about a force that did not vanish in a finite time. And then two people in particular that he may well have, whose views may have influenced his, especially Francis Hutcheson, who he probably first encountered during that year in 1713, when they were both students together at Glasgow, and probably both attended John Simpson's theology lectures at the same time. certainly in later life, they were friends and they had very similar views on things, on moral philosophy anyway, and natural theology. And second, his relationship with John Craig, who was a Scottish mathematician, natural philosopher, theologian, who by this time had moved down to England. And again, we know that Maclaurin made contact with him and became friends with him after this point in 1719 when he went down to London. But we don't know whether he'd read any of Craig's works or whether he was in contact with Craig at this time. And Craig had done a little bit of work along the same lines as Maclaurin, although he's best known for his work on the likelihood and the decay in belief in the words of the Bible, essentially, the accounts given in the Bible and the state of the evidential status of those. So that's me done. A lot of outstanding issues. I'd welcome thoughts and discussion.